Hi, Brett. I finished reviewing your work and I typed up a little report for you. I'm sorry I have to scroll up to the top. Just wanted to go over a few things with you because they'd be kind of hard to explain over the phone. I'm looking forward to talking to you. First, congratulations on your work. It's very interesting and, in my opinion, valuable, even though it kind of goes against scholarship just a little bit. But rules are made to be broken, so let's break them and break them hardcore. Um, I go over a few things with you. For one thing, you still need to work on making your um, material compelling. The principal problem here is that most people aren't going to be able to relate to your experience. And that is, for one thing, people aren't interested in Anglo-Saxon poetry, by and large, excuse me. And they're especially not interested in the process that you went through to discover words and the meanings of words and that kind of thing. However, in the middle of that, what is very important and compelling, in my opinion, the best part of your argument is that you need to take words at their meaning, and that, if you think about it, it has very obvious implications for people, and you can talk about that. Talk about why and how we take words at their meaning, the dangers of not taking words at their meaning, and the benefits of taking words at their meaning. That's exception. It's very easy to see when you're dealing with poetry why words are so important, but in life, why is it so important? In philosophy, why is it so important? Like, there's an intellectual point you can really drive home, but you can also work on applying that to people's lives. So that's that. You need to cross some important bridges in the text, and I've kind of hinted at that already. Like in interpretation, we talk about the original text and the modern meaning. So you have the Anglo-Saxons who originally heard the words, and then you have the hundreds and hundreds of years of history and development of language, and then today. So, excuse me. So you need to cross a bridge, and that bridge is what makes it relevant. And I hate to speak in metaphors, but everything the bridge is made out of, all the planks and cables and concrete and everything that gets you from the ancient world to today, needs to be made out of experiences that people can relate to. And sitting in the library searching for the meaning of word is something I can relate to as a scholar, and I really appreciate that. But most people aren't going to relate to that. However, most people can relate to the importance of taking words at their meaning. They don't know how to do that, so you need to show them. They don't know really the dangers of not doing it, so again, you need to show them. And so you need to hit people more where they live than hitting people like me where I live. So people could care less. You need to sell your book to people that don't care about Anglo-Saxon poetry. So you might want to think about changing your title of your book if you want to sell it. And even less people care about your personal journey. So we need to make them care about it because it is interesting and it is valuable. So I'm going to give you some suggestions about that. And first I got to tell you about, what is a bridge crossing. Not only is it hundreds of years of cultural development, language development, which is obvious. You also have intimidation. People are going to be intimidated by the very topic of poetry. Like, you obviously want to sell it to people that are interested in poetry, but most people think poetry's too hard. The last time they talked about poetry was in high school, and it wasn't any fun. Or God forbid, in college, and it wasn't any fun. And even me as a scholar, it's difficult to do poetry in other languages. So you have those two challenges. How do you overcome that challenge? Well, it's by making your book relevant and interesting at the very first word. So rhetorically, what you need to do is structure the book so that your most important points are first. And your most important point so far is taking, and I'm sorry I'm repeating myself, but it's taking the words at their meaning. So that needs to be front and center in the introduction, and then you build on that. And you can constantly be asking that question every time you present poetry in your chapters. What was the original meaning? How do we bring that meaning to today? You're hitting it out of the park with the palindrome, but it's just not relevant to the reader yet without crossing that bridge. So that's the outcome. I just basically said that. You need to arrange the material so that the reader, A, immediately understands the relevance of the content. Not just to you, but to them. Like, the book makes sense. Almost perfectly makes sense. I can imagine myself sitting in the library or sitting at my computer and going through this struggle with you to understand the meaning of the word and understand the philosophy. But you need to make it to where more readers, more people understanding that you're reading this book, they immediately understand. They don't have to wonder at all, why is he putting a poem at the front of the chapter? Why do words have their meaning? Why is that hidden way down in the text? So you need to arrange that so every step the reader takes, they're actually taking the step with you. Every step that you take, the reader's taking with you. And B, that the material is still arranged sensibly. Now, you have a good structure now with respect to the discovery of the palindrome, and that's good. But it's not structured so that the reader can understand the relevance of it with you. And you're almost there as far as the argument goes, as far as giving the reader enough information about the word, and giving enough information about the nature of the palindrome itself. That's good. What's missing is the relevance in the person's life. Intellectually, you're getting there, but the lived experience is missing, and that's so critical to why art is valuable. You're connecting the experience of the artist to the experience of the person enjoying the art. So right now you have a sketch, and I think that you know that. So you have the unifying theme of a timeline and a process of discovery. Now, one thing you need to be careful about is getting the timeline out of order. Like now, and it's appropriate. It really is appropriate now that for the structure of the book that you have, you're giving the reader the process of discovery, and in the process of discovery, you sometimes read in the beginning of your research process. You read stuff and you don't understand the significance. Like you learn something in your college career, and then as you're progressing through this process of discovery, suddenly you remember something you learned back in college is more important now than you knew back then. So you need to go back, you need to flash back in order to understand. Now, we need to think through this text and ask ourselves, do we really need it out of order? Like the timeline needs to be just as important as the process of discovery. So referring back to your college days in the middle of the process of discovery isn't helpful sometimes, and I marked that in the text. So structurally, the introduction is muddled and incomplete, and it's okay for now because the book's not finished. Like I write my introduction and conclusion together at the end of the process. So that way I include in their introduction everything that I need. Now, what you need to ask yourself as you're reading through this and doing self-editing is, number one, at the beginning of the book, does the reader have everything they need in order to understand you? You ended your introductory material with a question or with a statement, I can't remember what the statement was, but it was like a hook, like, let me tell you my story. And the problem was the reader is embarking on the journey with you, not knowing anything about really anything useful about what you're about to do. So the introduction should present the reader, I'm just going to highlight this so I'm just going to read it verbatim. It should present the reader with all the basic material the reader needs to know in order to understand your argument. Like you have an argument, right now your argument is the process of discovery. So you need to introduce the idea of the palindrome, introduce the idea of the role of philosophy, introduce all these ideas. Now, in its current structure, I don't think you should keep, so hold your horses on that, but you need to know that the introduction should include everything the reader should know. Now, most importantly, what is the use of all this material to the reader? What benefit is the reader going to get? And knowing the process of your discovery is not really beneficial to a lot of readers because they're not interested in that. It's almost like a dairy farmer discussing milk fat. Milk fat is really interesting, and a dairy farmer can tell you everything about how he learned about milk fat and the use of that in making milk delicious. But the reader wants to know how that affects their life, even their intellectual life. So then the preface material, if you choose to have a preface, is all the interesting behind the scenes material that the reader doesn't need in order to understand your argument. So there's a lot of stuff that I got the feeling I didn't need in order to understand you. Now, it's a memoir now, so there are things in the memoir that we don't need to understand the argument, to understand your learning process, but you need to ask yourself what's relevant and what's not. And I flagged some things I thought were irrelevant. So what's your argument now? I think it's allowing words to speak for themselves. Now, you need a lot more than that in order to sell this book. You need a lot of insights like that you can really develop and hammer in. And so my suggestion for you, if you want to keep chasing this words idea, you need to look into the philosophy of language and hermeneutics. And Hans-Georg Gadamer is the best place to start. I consider myself a Gadamerian philosopher because he talks a lot about how to communicate, how language functions, and it's the role of bias in language itself, and how humans can communicate with each other using language. It's a philosophy of why you understand what I'm telling you, and that can be very beneficial for you. Now, he wrote a big book. I mean, it's like a 1,000-page book on the philosophy of language, and it's just phenomenal. But you should be able to find summaries online, and you can feel free to ask me. If you look around, feel free to ask me if it's a good summary. However, one thing you got to keep in mind if you go down this philosophy road, not many people are philosophers. So you could, this just sucks because it could be moving you further away from bring your reader into a compelling understanding. So I still think finding principles would be good for you in this book. And one thing I suggested was, for one thing, I think what you have is great. But one thing that's missing is how the Anglo-Saxons used this poetry in the beginning. Like you got to create this bridge, like I said earlier, from the original context to today. And I don't think you spend any time on that original context. Like, for example, how did the original audience hear this material and apply it in their lives? Like, was it used, for example, by an Anglo-Saxon leader to motivate people to fight against all odds? Like they heard the Beowulf poem and lines from Beowulf, and it inspired them to go out and defeat an army that's bigger than them. And the reason why that's compelling is because a reader can instantly relate to that. Rather than the nature of the poetry, they can relate to the nature of how the poetry is used. Especially for you, especially if understanding it as a palindrome was so important to those original audiences. So I imagine a general motivating his troops, and he says the poem, and then even better if you have a listener that wrote something about it, and they said, oh man, this general just quoted from Beowulf, and it inspired all these people, and we had to understand it as a palindrome. That stuff really happens in history. Like whenever I'm studying the New Testament, I have the benefit of reading other first century authors like Plutarch and Seneca the Younger and Cicero, who died about 100 years before, but Cicero and Philo and all these other guys that are writing at the same time using the same language, and they're witness to how, for example, Socrates was used. Like all these guys are reading Socrates and quoting it to each other during critical times in their lives, and I can see how it's used Socrates is a bad example. I can use Euripides because that's also in the New Testament. So I can see how Euripides is used in the New Testament, and how one guy would quote Euripides to another guy in a certain context, and then I can say, well, Paul used it in this context, and then how we should use it in a similar context. Like going back to that example of a general using this, like this Anglo-Saxon poetry has inspired people for hundreds of years. The original audience is the most important. Secondary audiences, maybe 100 years after it's written, that's also pretty important. So you can actually trace how the palindrome was used compared to today. Now, back to your reader. Your reader constantly is in situations where it may be a delusion of grandeur, but like those Anglo-Saxon armies, they are facing troubles that feel overwhelming. And if this poetry was used to inspire an army to fight against an overwhelming opponent, you too can use that material to inspire people to overcome major obstacles. Now, that's just one example. So you're taking the original poetry, seeing how it's used, interpreting it, especially as a palindrome, and then instructing the reader and telling the reader how they can use it in their lives today. That's what makes material compelling, and that's what makes material sell. So you need, and if you can't do that, if you can't do that, you can at least go part of the way. How was it used in the past, and how is that important to understanding it now? You don't even have to actually go to the application, but every step that you take along that way is going to make your book more valuable. So with that, I have a 16-minute video in one take, and wish you well, and look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Oh, I need to also show you something in your book here. It hurt my eyes to read it as you presented it, so I changed the formatting a little bit, which is a benefit for you if you want to keep your book in that later version. Like I'm updating an earlier version than what you have. So I just want to show you what I did. I used styles up here, and I put it in justified text, and I used this no spacing. It should be, if you don't see it up here in your styles, you can go to your I don't even know what this is called. The way your styles are organized, and scroll down to no spacing, and click on show. You got to put it in your list up here. Anyway, you might not even need to do that or be interested in that. But I only formatted all the paragraphs, not any of the poetry. So when I click on it, I see that it says no spacing. Now, what you can do is, all of these paragraphs are the same. I double click on it. See it says select all 68 instances. You don't have to do that to modify it, but I'm going to go do it anyway. Select all 68 instances. You'll notice that I didn't format your titles and didn't format your poetry, so it's not going to affect the appearance there. But what you can do is, I clicked on that. I clicked on select all. I click on modify, and then you can modify it however you like. You can put in. You can go back to whatever spacing you had, or go to format paragraph and change the spacing and change the alignment. So you can get it. You can very quickly get it back to what you had originally, or you can ask me to do it for you. It'll only take me a minute if you want to use this copy. So just make a note of that. It was just really hard for me to read. I know that it's standard manuscript format to have it a jagged edge on the right, but for me, I deal with published manuscripts, and I just couldn't handle it. So anyway, thank you so much for choosing me and listening to this video if you did, and have a good day, Brett.